So y'all know how to read titles and thumbnails. Today I'm going to finally pick between Genshin and Honkai Star Rail and tell y'all which game I think is better. I decided to make this video because I'm finally caught up in Honkai Star Rail and Genshin has had some new updates, so it just seemed like a good time. I'm gonna break these games down into 3 different categories and rank them based on these metrics. After that, I'll give y'all my final ranking and we'll know once and for all which game is better. In my opinion at least. So with all that being said, let's get into it. Honkai Star Rail and Genshin are 2 very different games mechanics-wise. Whereas Genshin is an open-world action RPG, Honkai Star Rail has more of a turn-based JRPG style game. Playing Honkai Star Rail definitely reminds me more of games like Persona 5, whereas Genshin reminds me more of things like Kingdom Hearts. Because of these styles of games, there are going to be natural limitations each game possesses. For example, I loathe the fact that Honkai Star Rail has no jumping mechanic, and it's super easy to get stuck on little ledges when you're trying to run away from enemies, which is beyond annoying. Whereas with Genshin, because of the nature of an action open world aesthetic, I lose track of quests a lot, and it can feel a little difficult for me at least to keep track of certain things. However, because of Honkai Star Rail's JRPG style game, grinding is way easier in Honkai Star Rail, and that's without the added quality of life benefits that Honkai Star Rail has. The fact that I can auto-complete domains to gain relics, XP, or ascension materials makes it way less of a hassle to actually level and build characters. When you add this to quality of life upgrades we've gotten, like being able to set build goals for characters, seeing exactly how much you need to make a character do a certain thing, it makes the overall experience of grinding in Honkai Star Rail much more enjoyable. This is especially important when you remember that these games are both gacha games, and many like me are free to play. This means being able to build characters easily and gain in-game currency to pull for said characters is incredibly important, if not the most important gameplay mechanic. Genshin, by contrast, I would argue has a really terrible grinding experience. Now, I will preface this by saying I hate grinding. It's the thing I hate to do most in games, which is ironic considering I pretty much exclusively play RPG games. But even with that said, Genshin's grinding experience is one of the most atrocious I've ever had to do. While I can forgive things like running around in the world to collect ascension materials, especially now that we can mark where it is on the map, and it is open world so it makes sense why we would have to do that, where Genshin drops off is with artifact, weapon, and talent grinding. In Genshin, domains are only available on certain days. If you want to grind for a specific weapon, but you can't log in on that specific day to do it, well, you're kind of shit out of luck. Now, I will say most domains are open at least one day on the weekend, but when you're trying to manage grinding for multiple characters, you almost need a spreadsheet available to keep track of what domains are open when. And this isn't just for weapons either, it's also for talent domains. Now, I will say all talent domains are open on Sundays, but again, when you factor in things like resin caps and then factor in the fact that you need to grind for artifacts and do boss domains, it isn't feasible to try and do all of your grinding on Sunday. When you boil it down, the main reason I would say Honkai Star Rail blows past Genshin in terms of gameplay mechanics is simply because Honkai Star Rail is way more convenient to play. Now, I will fully admit, I'm a casual player. Mini-maxing builds, following meta, that's just never really been my thing. And for people who do enjoy those things and enjoy a more involved grinding gameplay process, you're probably going to like Genshin more. But given the main reason I play these games is because I enjoy the story and setting, having an easy way to grind and farm for in-game currency is much more important to me. As a final note here, I will say that I feel like Honkai Star Rail is more free-to-play friendly in terms of farming for in-game currency, but not for characters. I say this because when I put about the same amount of effort into both games, I was able to farm enough in-game currency for about 60 pulls in Honkai Star Rail, versus Genshin, where I was lucky to get 20 pulls in the same amount of time. Again though, this is coming from somebody who is a casual player. I just don't have time to sit and grind for hours in Genshin, which is why I think I have to give the win here to Honkai Star Rail. Though, I'm going to be talking about free-to-play friendly character options later on, so let's put a pin in that. Now, moving on to storytelling. Both games are from Hoyo, which means they're going to have really similar storytelling practices. Additionally, I'm going to preface this section by pointing out 2 important things. 1, Honkai Star Rail is not as far along in its story as Genshin, which is going to impact its storytelling quality. Most people, I think, can agree that Genshin's story really started popping off around Sumeru or Fontaine. And that's not to say Genshin's story wasn't good before that, it just wasn't quite as amazing. And this is coming from a person that ranked Fontaine in 5th place in terms of overall storytelling for Genshin, which, if you haven't watched my Archon Quest ranking video, you should, and it's linked in the description. So Honkai Star Rail is going to get some leniency because they're earlier in their game development process. The second important thing to note, though, is that the developer has actively come out and said they're not pleased with the direction of their storytelling in either game, so they're going to be implementing some changes to attempt to make the story experience better for players. This is extremely exciting, mostly because in Genshin, I'm hoping this is going to fix the pacing issues we've been running into since Inazuma, and in Honkai Star Rail, I'm really hoping that this is going to help these story writers bring the scope of the story down a bit more and make things feel more streamlined. This development would be well received, at least on my end, because I personally hated the Penacony story for the sole reason that it was just too much. There was too much going on, there were too many characters, and the overall story felt disjointed and convoluted. Now, with those two things out of the way, what I'm gonna say is probably gonna ruffle a few feathers, but I think while Genshin and Honkai Star Rail are actually really neck and neck, Genshin hedges out just slightly above Honkai Star Rail. Genshin's story for right now is confined to Teyvat, which makes the story inherently more manageable in terms of characters and locations. As I stated in my Archons vs. Eons video, which again, if you haven't watched it, go watch it, it'll be linked in the description, Genshin and Honkai Star Rail are stories told on two very different scales. Genshin is confined to Teyvat for right now, whereas Honkai Star Rail has the entire cosmos at its disposal. The developers, in my opinion, have struggled in certain key aspects with Genshin's story, namely pacing, but due to the limited nature of the story setting, they haven't run into these same glaring problems that Honkai Star Rail has, with too many characters being involved in one story. The other big thing Genshin has going for it when compared to Honkai Star Rail is that you don't really need any prior knowledge of the Honkaiverse to start playing Genshin. For someone like me who's never played any Honkai game outside of Honkai Star Rail, there's certain parts of Honkai Star Rail that kind of feel disjointed and strange, especially if you're a lore deep diver like I am. It requires you to have some pre-existing knowledge of the Honkaiverse, and I just simply don't have that. Whereas with Genshin, I can dive in as deep as I want without feeling like I'm missing key pieces. More than that, Genshin has an easier time including characters we've met from other nations back into the story. Again, this comes back to a sense of scale. With Genshin, it's reasonable to assume characters might travel to other nations, but in Honkai Star Rail, the Astral Express pretty much needs to return to individual spaceships or planets to include them back into the story, which can sometimes feel a little forced. I will say though that while I do believe overall the Genshin main story is just slightly stronger than Honkai Star Rail, both games do very well in what I would consider to be side missions. These are character stories and interlude quests in Genshin, and the companion and continuance missions in Honkai Star Rail. Both of these story types in both games feel very valuable to play and are rewarding in their own ways, both in terms of lore but also in making us feel closer to specific characters. So, to sum up, I do think Genshin has a slightly stronger storytelling aspect to it than Honkai Star Rail. This is in part because Genshin has an easier time finding its footing in terms of storytelling due to the smaller scale of the game, and also partially due to the fact that Genshin doesn't feel as convoluted as Honkai Star Rail because it doesn't include as much Honkai-specific lore. While I'm giving Genshin the win here, I don't think Honkai Star Rail's story is bad. I'm especially very happy with Amphoreus right now, and I've really enjoyed the continuance missions, especially with the Law Fu, but I do think Honkai Star Rail is still trying to find the best way to tell its story, and that comes across heavily in parts of the story like Penacony, where the devs had trouble narrowing down their ideas and scope, making the story too long and too complicated. So now we're down to our final metric, and that being the characters themselves. This category isn't just based on how many characters I personally would simp for in each game, though a character's ability to compel me is important. It's going to be about the overall power balance that the games have for their characters as well. So, starting us off with the main characters, Honkai Star Rail has a much more entertaining MC than Genshin's MC, and as a bonus, Honkai Star Rail has no Paimon, which, believe me as a Genshin player, is a big bonus. I go way more in depth on this topic in my Traveler vs Trailblazer video, so go check that out if you want the full rundown, but TLDR, it's way more fun playing as the Trailblazer than it is to play as the Traveler in terms of dialogue and storytelling options. However, once we move outside of that, Honkai Star Rail starts losing in the polls quite rapidly. This is again because of the scale of the story. When you have a story that is so grand in scale, you have to be very diligent about how you include characters into that story. This is partially because there will always be a ton of characters to include, because again, we're talking about the entire cosmos, but also because it's really hard to dedicate sufficient storytelling time to get to know and care for these characters without it getting in the way of the story. Again, to give Honkai Star Rail some credit, I would make the argument that the characters in Amphoreus have been much stronger overall, which makes sense for the most part because we're focusing on what's happening in Amphoreus rather than the cosmos as a whole. But to show you what I mean, let's use Acheron as an example. Overall, if you look at Acheron on paper, she's a really cool character, but because she was introduced in Penacony and too much time was spent in the main story focusing on her and her interactions with the old Galaxy Ranger, which were mostly just static images with her talking in the background, she got incredibly boring, and a lot of people, me included, didn't pay attention to her because it felt like she was detracting from the overall story. Every time we went into her background, all I wanted to do was get back to the main story of Penacony. Now, if by contrast, Acheron had had hints thrown in about her background throughout the story, and then we had the Aventurine boss fight, and then we had the rest of her background behind a character story quest, I think Acheron would have been a much more interesting character. But because Penacony's story was already too complicated, with too many characters and too many moving parts, Acheron ended up feeling like she was getting in the way of the story. Acheron isn't the only character in Penacony that felt this way either. I would make the argument that Sparkle and Firefly are also in this camp. This is not to say that they are bad characters, but that their stories and introductions weren't done well, and that made the characters feel like they were in the way of the story overall, versus feeling like the characters were helping move the story along. And now we're also going to get into why Genshin honestly has better free-to-play team comp options than Honkai Star Rail. Now, what do I mean by this? Basically, I think Genshin has a wider array of characters to choose from, which makes the game more playable. Now, some of you might want to point out that Genshin has more characters because they've been going on for longer, and that's true, but it's more than that. Even if we were to just restrict Genshin to the characters released by version 3.2, a similar space we find ourselves in with Honkai Star Rail right now, you'll note that there are a lot more 4-star and more free-to-play friendly options for team comps. A lot of people have complained about the lack of 4-star characters in Honkai Star Rail, and it's a recent development in Genshin as well, where we're seeing a lack of 4 stars. But the problem is that Genshin has enough characters by this point in the game to counteract that, whereas Honkai Star Rail really only has 5-star options for the most part if you want your team to be viable. This isn't to say that you can't play the game with some of the 4 stars that you can get, but especially as you move later in the game, it becomes more and more necessary to pull for 5-star characters to keep your team viable. Because of that, Honkai Star Rail is a lot less free-to-play friendly than Genshin. Now, I will say to give a point to Honkai Star Rail, even though their characters aren't as free-to-play friendly, farming for in-game currency is a lot easier, so you're going to be more likely to be able to pull for 5 stars. But again, then you're leaving it down to luck, and I personally usually have really terrible luck, so I don't really want to leave it down to that. Even with this being said though, the lack of free-to-play friendly character options causes Honkai Star Rail to take a major hit in this category. Add in the fact that they have trouble with proper character storytelling, in my opinion, it's plain to see that Genshin wins in this category by a landslide. So all of this is said, the rankings are in, and overall, I think Genshin is a better story to Honkai Star Rail. That being said, even though I think Genshin is the better game, I actually enjoy playing Honkai Star Rail more. Now, some of you might be like, wait, what the fuck? Then why isn't Honkai Star Rail the better game if you like playing it more? What kind of glazing shit is this? And you have an excellent point. Overall, because of Genshin's gameplay mechanics, I'm honestly really burnt out in terms of actually building characters and farming for pulls. If that were my metric alone, then Honkai Star Rail would have won in a landslide. But when Genshin drops a new Archon quest, I'm immediately pulled back in, And honestly, I'm way more excited to play an Archon quest than I am to play a Trailblazer mission. And this is just because I find the story and the characters more compelling overall. Now, does that mean that I think Honkai Star Rail is bad? Absolutely not. Honkai Star Rail is a great game and I am excited to play more of it, but as someone new to the Honkai franchise, I just feel like Genshin is a better game for my player profile. Does this mean I think Genshin is the best game ever made? Absolutely not. Watch any of my Genshin videos and you'll hear me complain about Genshin. But Genshin fits me better as a player right now, and they do have stronger storytelling and character development overall when you compare it to Honkai Star Rail. So, what do y'all think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? Do you think I should be burned at the stake? Let me know in the comments below. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share with a friend, and most importantly, and as previously mentioned, comment so I don't feel like I'm screaming into the void. As always, may the wind bless your travels, and may your journey take you starward.